Dr. Robert Jacobs, a research associate professor of nuclear history and culture at Hiroshima Peace Institute. Well, the latest report, sir, that we're getting is that there has been an explosion at Fukushima #1 nuclear power plant. Now, what could this mean? We still have to get details, but what could this mean?
Well, I'm not an expert on nuclear power plants, but having studied the history of these incidents in the past, I know that at this reactor there had been attempts to reduce the pressure inside the reactor core and to cool the reactor to avoid meltdown. To see an explosion, as we saw in that building, obviously indicates a failure in those efforts. Clearly, the situation in this reactor is not under control if there's an explosion of that sort that blows the building apart. So it would, it's hard to say exactly what it reflects, but it would certainly indicate the likelihood of a partial meltdown and the potentiality of a full meltdown.
Okay, well, we are still, of course, getting the details, so we can speculate with as much facts that we have right now. What do you think caused the explosion? Because we have been reporting that it's the cooling system that's not working, and this has been the cause, the root cause of the worry of the government to keep the temperatures are going at very high levels. Do you think this could be the reason why an explosion occurs? Is this what a meltdown is? What is a meltdown?
Well, a meltdown is in order to keep the fuel of a nuclear power plant cool, that fuel is cooled with water. The heat of the reactor rods will boil that water, and that will escape as steam, which will be somewhat radioactive. So new water needs to be continually pumped through in order to cool these rods down. What's failed in these reactors is the cooling system because of its dependency on electricity in order to run the cooling systems. So with no access to electricity, the backup generators that were initially there at these plants did fail because of the tsunami and the earthquake. And so generators, battery-driven generators, had been brought in order to pump the water and cool the fuel rods. It appears as though they were having trouble maintaining the flow of water to cool these rods. Now, if the water boils away and the rods are exposed, then the rods will begin to melt, and the fuel will begin to melt down. When this happens, there'll be a much larger release of radiation into the environment than is released by the steam of the water boiling away. So it would appear, given the fact that there was an explosion in this building, that the likelihood that there is remaining water cooling these rods would have to be very slim at this point.
Well, you're saying that the solution that they had implemented initially is to try to use water to cool down the reactors, but it's not working. So what other ways are there? Is that the only way? How could they stop this situation from getting any worse?
Well, they need water to cool it. It's just a matter of how to make that system operate. In order to make that system operate, they need energy. The problem with these plants is that the access to electricity was cut. So there was no electricity to power the cooling systems. The backup system to that is to have generators. The generators failed because either of the earthquake or the tsunami perhaps rendering the generators inoperable. The backup system to that is to have battery-driven generators, which will then work the cooling system and cool and continue to pump water in to keep the rods in water and to keep the rods cooled down. So ultimately what has to happen is that this water does need to flow to keep these rods cooled down. So it's simply a matter of how to get sufficient energy to the system to make the system operable. So I know that additional batteries and generators had been brought in, but it appears as though the situation was not very easy to control. And one of the worrying things is that there are similar problems in keeping the cooling water flowing in several others of the reactors. Remember, at each of these sites, there are a number of reactors. At Fukushima #1, where the explosion happened, there are 6 nuclear reactors. And at Fukushima #2, which is 10 miles away, there are 4 more reactors. And there's also at the Onagawa plant, which is further north from there, there's 3 reactors. So this is a problem that they've had with a number of the reactors to keep the coolant water flowing. So regardless of the explosion at this reactor, they still face a problem of getting sufficient electricity to run the cooling systems at many of the other reactors, which is why there have been evacuations around 1 or 2 other reactors as well. So the situation does not appear, the situation appears to be deteriorating.
Okay, I just want to ask you about a report we're getting, just to give us an idea, for those of us who have not seen an actual reactor, that the roof of the reactor has said to be collapsed. What does this mean? Does this mean a total breach of the facility? How is the roof structured in relation to the actual reactor?
I don't know the designs. As I say, I'm not an expert on nuclear power plants, so I don't know the designs of this specific plant. But there is a containment vessel around these reactors, unlike the reactor at Chernobyl and some of the Chernobyl-type design reactors. So I can't say from watching that explosion whether or not that containment has been breached or not. If that containment has been breached, then that would allow for an easy escape of radiation into the environment. If the containment is not breached, then even with a meltdown, there may be an ability to contain the contamination at the local site. So this is one of the things we'll have to learn in the next few hours as to how severe this explosion was and what facilities at the reactor were left intact and which were breached.
Okay, well, now an emergency situation has been declared at 2 nuclear facilities and 5 reactors. Well, how dire is the situation? What is your assessment? Do you see a repeat of Chernobyl, the Chernobyl catastrophe in Japan? How do we look at this situation unfolding?
We look at this situation as a very grim and dire situation unfolding, and we hope that it can be resolved and that enough resources and electricity can be brought to bear in order to get the coolant water flowing and make sure that those reactor cores are cooled down. The grim situation would be if this has been a partial meltdown or a more serious meltdown, that this be contained at only this one reactor. The worst case scenario would be that similar situations could happen at another reactor or two. And in a sense, these reactors are much larger than the Chernobyl reactors in terms of the amount of fuel and the amount of electricity that they generate. So the potential for larger releases of radiation is there if the situation is not brought under control.
And of course, in natural disasters, the concern would definitely be the lives of people, the safety of people, where radiation levels are said to be growing rapidly. Just how dangerous is it for people locally, especially those within the vicinity of the facility?
Well, that's unknowable without more precise information about exactly what has happened and exactly what the radiation levels are. But clearly, any exposure to radiation at all is bad for the human body and bad for human health. There's been warnings already on Japanese television and in the region to take precautions to minimize exposures to radiation. The people are now being told to stay in their homes rather than to evacuate, which would be an indicator of the presence of radiation in the atmosphere. But it's not a simple matter to keep radiation outside of the house, although it will minimize exposures. So the people in those areas and the people in the downwind areas are certainly in significant risk of having exposures that could lead to health problems, depending on the size of the releases and the amount of radiation that enters the atmosphere, the nearby atmosphere. There's a possibility that areas around the plants could be left much like the area around Chernobyl, as areas that wouldn't be lived in and wouldn't be entered. That's a worst case scenario. If that's the case, to contain that area into as small an area as possible is the goal. So people in those areas should follow the guidances of the government officials, but they should definitely take steps to minimize their exposures in any way to radiation.
Okay, but what about people, well, the rest of the world for that matter? We've seen, going back again to Chernobyl, it's the effect of the radiation spread for miles. What about in the case of Japan? Do we see that spreading for miles? You were mentioning a downwind. How would that affect the rest of the world?
Well, if there's a significant release of radiation into the atmosphere, that can easily go into the upper atmosphere and then spread in the upper atmosphere around the globe. This kind of radiation will typically come down from the upper atmosphere with precipitation like rain or snow, which makes if there is a very, very significant release into the atmosphere, people certainly in Japan and in the region here and potentially even across the Pacific Ocean would want to avoid exposure to rain over the next week or two. But this is a worst case scenario. There's no guarantee that anything like that would happen, but that is what could happen. That is what happened in Chernobyl. There was radioactive particles coming down in rain in areas in North America and certainly throughout Europe and Asia immediately after the Chernobyl disaster.
Okay, well, we just go back to the massive earthquake that struck Japan yesterday. That's Friday afternoon. Now, Japan's flats, that is, the buildings, they have been designed to withstand earthquakes, considering Japan is on the cusp of three very active tectonic plates. Do you think more could have been done in terms of infrastructure to prevent a catastrophe, the effects of a disaster like this, in terms of damage to infrastructure or lives saved?
Well, certainly it's easy to say that more could be done, but there is no upward threshold to that dilemma. For example, there may have been a 9-point earthquake. You know, it's possible that there could be a 10-point earthquake. So it's impossible to design these plants to an unlimited level of safety. Given that, they're always subject to natural disasters, in which case the stress put on the plant by the disasters exceeds the design of the plants themselves. And so therefore it's essential to be aware that this kind of danger will always exist. And when you're dealing with one of the things I would say about nuclear power is that when you're dealing with materials that remain toxic for periods of potentially thousands of years, the dangers are significant, and the dangers need to be understood over a long period of time, and not just in the short term in terms of generating electricity. So while more could be done, certainly there's no point you could reach where you would say that a plant is now beyond the possibility of damage from natural disasters. There's always that potential.
Okay, well, just allow me to pick your brain here a little. We know that Japan, again, as I mentioned earlier, is within the ring of fire, the massive tectonic plates, so they are very prone to earthquakes. We all know that. But, you know, building nuclear power plants, was that putting the country at risk, knowing that earthquakes occur frequently in Japan? Was that too much of a risk to have nuclear power plants in the country?
Well, in my judgment, I believe it's too much of a risk to have nuclear power plants anywhere. The judgment was made at the time, because Japan has no energy sources, it has no coal or gas or oil, that in order to achieve independence, nuclear power was one way to achieve energy independence. And this is a similar path and logic that's followed by France, which has the highest amount of its electricity generated by nuclear power plants. In living in an earthquake zone, no matter what you put there, there's a danger, of course, that there could be explosions. There could be explosions at coal-generated plants. So there's always this danger. One of the reasons that I'm opposed to nuclear power is because these dangers then entail toxins and poisons which far outlive the damage of explosions or the kinds of incidents that can happen when there's an earthquake. You find that the trauma and the health threat will last far beyond the incident itself. So to me, it's an especially serious danger that would preclude putting nuclear power plants in earthquake zones. But I would say that for similar reasons, there's argument against putting them anywhere.
Okay, well, just a bit more information. You kept mentioning the health effects of very high levels of radiation on the population. Just in layman's terms, what are these effects? Cancer comes to mind. What are the effects of very high levels of radiation?
There's increased risk of cancers. There's increased risk of immune disorder diseases. There's a variety of types of cancers that can be induced by exposures to radiation. There's certainly more health risks, although not being a health professional or an epidemiologist, I really couldn't describe them in more detail, so I don't want to misrepresent them. But I know that radiation exposures are typified by increased levels of cancer and immune disorders.